tires of the Porsche Cayenne Turbo didn't hum, they groaned. The vehicle, a high-performance beast far too refined for the crumbling, gray-veined throat of the Toluca Lake access road, shuddered as it hit another pothole concealed by the thickening miasma. Inside the cabin, the scent was a sterile cocktail of expensive leather and the sharp metallic tang of a cleaned RSH-12. Leon S. Kennedy shifted gears with a practiced, mechanical fluidity. His gloved hand lingered on the shifter for a fraction of a second too long, feeling the unnatural vibration bleeding through the floorboards. This wasn't just poor infrastructure. The air outside the reinforced glass didn't behave like weather. It didn't drift. It pulsed. It clung to the chassis like a wet shroud, turning the world into a claustrophobic, monochrome blur. He checked the rear view. The road behind him had already vanished, swallowed by a wall of white that seemed to move with intent. "Great," Leon muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely stirred the silence of the interior. "A resort town with zero visibility. Guess I should have called ahead for the silent treatment." He reached over to the passenger seat, his fingers brushing the matte black finish of the RSH-12. The Russian-made revolver was an absolute brick of a firearm, chambered in 12.7 by 55 millimeter, a caliber designed to stop armored targets or small buildings. In the wake of the Requiem incident, Leon had stopped packing for survival and started packing for extinction. If Umbrella was running a localized viral trial here, he wasn't going to dance with the bioweapons. He was going to erase them. The SUV lurched. The steering wheel fought him, kicking back with a sudden, violent jerk as the front left tire struck something that wasn't a rock. It felt soft, muffled. The physics of the impact were deceptively simple, yet biologically catastrophic. The 3-ton luxury vehicle, traveling at precisely 42 miles per hour, had encountered a mass of necrotic tissue roughly the weight of a Great Dane. The Porsche's suspension system, engineered for the Autobahn, struggled to compensate for the sudden vertical displacement. Leon didn't brake. His neural pathways, honed by decades of bioorganic nightmares, prioritized momentum over curiosity. He knew that in a theater of operations, this silent stopping was a formal invitation to an autopsy. Leon's eyes narrowed, scanning the dashboard. The GPS was a dead sea of static. The clock on the dash flickered, the digital digits spinning in a frantic, nonsensical loop before settling on a frozen 0, 0, 0, 0. "Digital detox," Leon remarked, the corner of his mouth twitching into a joyless smirk. Umbrella's really leaning into the vintage aesthetic this time. He brought the Porsche to a controlled crawl as the silhouette of a roadside sign materialized through the soup. It was rusted, the edges jagged like a serrated blade. "Welcome to Silent Hill." The air through the vents began to change. The charcoal filters designed to scrub pollutants were failing against a scent that shouldn't have been possible. Old copper, wet wool, and the unmistakable cloying sweetness of a funeral parlor. A shape detached itself from the fog 20 yards ahead. It didn't walk. It twitched, a series of staccato, spasmodic lurches that defied human kinesiology. It was a pale, bulbous mass wrapped in what looked like its own translucent skin, arms fused to its torso in a permanent, agonizing straitjacket. It had no face, only a vertical seam that seeped a dark, viscous fluid. Leon didn't flinch. He didn't even slow down. He simply reached for the ARSH-12, the heavy cylinder clicking into place with the finality of a guillotine. "Sorry, pal," Leon said, his finger tightening on the heavy double-action trigger. The town's full. Try the next life. The 12.7 millimeter round didn't just hit the creature, it deleted the space the creature occupied. The muzzle flash was a blinding ultraviolet bloom in the gray gloom, the sonic boom of the discharge shattering the Porsche's side window. The massive slug caught the lying figure in the upper chest. Kinetic energy, equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer swung by a giant, liquefied the creature's internal structure instantly. Its torso didn't rupture. It vaporized into a spray of gray-black slush that painted the asphalt. The remaining lower half of the entity was tossed backward by the sheer vacuum of the bullet's wake, tumbling into the mist like a discarded rag. Leon exhaled, the acrid scent of cordite drowning out the smell of the town for a glorious fleeting second. He rolled his neck, the vertebrae popping in the sudden, ringing silence. "That's one way to clear the air," he whispered. He pushed the door open. The mist surged into the cabin, cold and hungry. As his boots hit the grit of the road, the silence of Silent Hill rushed back in, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to swallow the echoes of his gunshot. Somewhere in the distance, a low metallic scraping sound began. Rhythmic, deliberate. Leon checked the massive cylinder of his revolver. 5 rounds left. 5 problems solved. "Hope there's a gift shop," he muttered, adjusting the collar of his tactical jacket against the unnatural chill. "I'm gonna need a my bioweapon trip sucked t-shirt." He began to walk, the Porsche's headlights cutting 2 weak yellow tunnels into the encroaching dark. He didn't look back. In this town, looking back was usually how they caught you. The interior of Neely's bar smelled of spilled cheap whiskey and decades of stagnant regret, a scent that Leon's heightened senses cataloged with the clinical detachment of a federal agent. He didn't just enter a room, he cleared it. The ARS-H-12 was held in a low-ready position, its massive frame an anchor of cold steel in a world made of shifting gray shadows. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned with a hollow rhythmic density, as if the wood itself were gasping for air. Leon moved with a predatory grace, his boots making a soft, percussive thud, click on the grime-slicked linoleum. He reached the bar top where a layer of dust sat undisturbed, save for a single jagged streak that looked like a finger had been dragged through it recently. "Service here is about as fast as a zombie in a swamp," Leon muttered, his voice echoing with a dry, sardonic edge. He didn't look for a bell, he looked for a map. His fingers closed around a damp, folded piece of parchment sitting next to a rotary phone that was bleeding a low-frequency hum. As he unfolded it, the ink seemed to writhe, the street names shifting from legible English into a series of bruised purplish smears. The environmental psychology of the room was attempting a standard isolation protocol. By flickering the overhead fluorescent light at a precise 14 Hz frequency, the town was attempting to trigger a minor seizure in the subject's occipital lobe. Leon, however, had spent 48 hours straight in the neon-drenched hell of the Neo Umbrella Labs in Lanxiang. His nervous system didn't just ignore the strobe, it processed the flickering as a series of tactical intervals. He wasn't trapped in the dark. He was simply waiting for the next 0.04-second window of illumination to verify the exit's location. The town was playing a psychological game against a man who had already beaten the final boss of trauma. Leon leaned against the bar, the heavy revolver resting on the wood. He picked up the handset of the rotary phone. There was no dial tone, only the sound of a heavy, wet breathing, followed by a voice that sounded like it was being squeezed through a throat filled with broken glass. "Leon, help me. It's so cold." Leon didn't gasp. He didn't drop the phone. He simply checked his watch, noting the frozen hands. "You're late, Ida." Leon said, his tone flat, unimpressed. The distressed damsel routine went out of style in '98. If you're going to haunt me, at least bring some intel. Or some better reception. He slammed the receiver back onto the cradle. The sound was a sharp, violent crack that seemed to offend the very silence of the bar. I was hiding in the storage closet, squeezed between crates of sour mix and expired bitters. I could see him through the slat in the door. This guy in a leather jacket that cost more than my car, holding a gun that looked like it belonged on a tank. He wasn't scared. That was the scariest part. The walls were literally starting to bleed. I could hear the wallpaper peeling back like skin. And this guy was making jokes to a dead phone. He moved like a machine, like he was counting the steps. When he looked toward the closet, his eyes weren't human. They were cold, bluer than the ice in the freezer. I didn't breathe. I didn't want him to find me, because I realized the things out there weren't hunting him. He was hunting them. Leon's head snapped toward the back of the bar. A radio sitting on a shelf began to shriek, a high-pitched electronic wail that vibrated in his molars. It wasn't just static. It was a warning. The back door of the bar kicked open. A creature stumbled in, its head a frantic, blurred vibration of flesh, its body a patchwork of stitched-together limbs that ended in sharpened, necrotic bone. It was a needler, a manifestation of domestic agony. But to Leon, it was just another bioorganic anomaly with a high-threat profile. "What's the matter?" Leon asked, his thumb pulling back the hammer of the RSH-12 with a heavy, mechanical clack. "Forget your keys!" The creature lunged, its bone blades whistling through the air with a sickening shink. Leon didn't retreat. He stepped into the strike, his left forearm parrying the creature's wrist, while his right hand jammed the muzzle of the RSH-12 directly into the entity's convulsing chest. The discharge was a physical event. The 12.7 millimeter slug didn't just penetrate, it created a supersonic pressure wave inside the creature's thoracic cavity. The needler's back exploded outward in a fan of gray marrow and shredded muscle, the force of the exit wound pinning the remains of the monster to the far wall. The sound was a thunderclap that blew out every glass on the bar rail simultaneously. Leon stood in the center of the raining shards, the smoke from his barrel curling upward into the flickering light. He didn't even blink as a piece of glass grazed his cheek, drawing a thin crimson line. "Check, please," he said, wiping the blood away with the back of his glove. He turned and walked toward the front door, the map tucked into his belt. The town was screaming now, a low tectonic rumble that shook the foundations of the street. It realized that the tourist wasn't following the script. The lobby of the Woodside Apartments didn't welcome visitors. It tolerated them. The air was a stagnant, pressurized soup of wet cardboard and the sour, alkaline sting of a leaking battery. Leon stepped over a pile of moldering mail, the heavy tread of his boots echoing with a flat, dead thud against the waterlogged carpet. He didn't need the flashlight. The emergency lighting was trapped in a perpetual, rhythmic spasm, casting long, jittering shadows that stretched and retracted like the legs of a dying spider. Leon's eyes, trained to track the micro-movements of T-virus variants in pitch-black sewers, didn't fight the darkness. They mapped it. "Great," Leon said, his gaze drifting to a cluster of headless, limbless torsos propped up against the mailboxes. "The town's decorator went to the creepy thrift store School of Design. Someone get this place a feng shui consultant?" He moved toward the staircase, the ASH-12 held in a high-compressed ready position. The weight of the 12.7 millimeter revolver was a comforting, solid constant. In a reality that felt increasingly like a fever dream, he reached the second-floor landing and stopped. The hallway was a gauntlet, They stood in the flickering strobe, mannequins, two pairs of feminine legs stitched together at the waist, one pair pointing up, the other down, forming a grotesque, symmetrical pillar of plasticized flesh. There were dozens of them. They didn't move while the light was on, but in the 0.2-second intervals of darkness, the wet, slapping sound of rubberized feet on carpet signaled their advancement. The tactical geometry of the hallway was a bottleneck designed to induce claustrophobic paralysis. The entities relied on a primitive, stop-motion predatory reflex. They didn't possess nervous systems, skeletal structures, or vital organs. To Leon S. Kennedy, they were simply soft-target obstacles. He calculated the structural integrity of the hallway's lath and plaster walls. The 12.7 by 55 millimeter rounds would pass through at least 3 of these entities, and the rear drywall, before losing lethal kinetic energy. Leon didn't wait for the light to fail again. He leaned into a wide, stable shooting stance. "Sorry, ladies," Leon remarked, his finger finding the wall of the trigger. "But I'm not really into the legs for days look when they're growing out of your neck." The RSH-12 roared. A sequence of 3 rapid-fire discharges turned the narrow corridor into a wind tunnel of fire and lead. The first 12.7 millimeter slug struck the lead mannequin dead center. The hollow point expansion didn't just mushroom, it tore through the rubbery flesh like a hot spade through wax. The round exited the first creature, tumbled, and caught the second mannequin in the lower waist, shearing both legs off with the raw torque of its rotation. Leon moved forward with the recoil, using the muzzle flash as a temporary sun. He fired again. A mannequin lunging from a side alcove was met with a point-blank shot to its upper apex. The force didn't just stop it. It sent the 200-pound mass of fused limbs hurtling backward into a bathroom door. Splintering the wood into toothpicks, the hallway was suddenly silent, save for the heavy metallic clink of Leon's spent casings hitting the floor and the wet, dying twitch of plasticized muscle. Leon reached the end of the hall, his boots crunching on a mixture of drywall dust and gray, synthetic ichor. He paused at the door to room 208, where a massive rusted metal pyramid was visible through a gap in the wall. Slowly turning to face him, "You must be the manager," Leon said, his hand reaching for his speed loader with a rhythmic, unhurried precision. "I'd like to file a complaint about the housekeeping." The metal triangle let out a low, grinding screech that vibrated the floorboards. Leon clicked the fresh cylinder into place, the sound of the locking lug echoing like a death knell. "Actually," Leon smirked, "don't bother. I'll just take it out of your deposit." The great knife didn't move with the fluid grace of a duelist. It moved with the agonizing, tectonic inevitability of a glacier calving into a dead sea. The rusted steel shrieked against the floorboards, a sound that bypassed the eardrums, and vibrated directly into the marrow of Leon's teeth. Leon didn't back away. He adjusted his center of gravity, his boots finding purchase in the rot-softened carpet. "Nice accessory," Leon said, his eyes tracking the minute tremors in the executioner's gargantuan, blood-slicked biceps. "A bit heavy for a home defense build, don't you think?" Pyramid Head didn't answer. It exhaled, a wet, rattling sound like a lung full of iron filings, and swung. The great knife reached a terminal velocity of 60 miles per hour within a 3-foot arc. The sheer displacement of air should have been enough to rupture a normal human's equilibrium. Leon, however, didn't move until the 0.9-second mark. He didn't dive. He pivoted. His evasion was a masterpiece of biomechanical economy. a 3-inch tilt of the torso that allowed the rusted edge to pass so close it sheared the tactical radio off his shoulder strap. The knife buried itself 4 inches deep into the doorframe of room 208, the building itself groaning as the structural lath shattered. Leon didn't waste the opening. He brought the ARSH-12 up, the muzzle less than 3 feet from the center of that impenetrable, rusted mitre. "Let's see if there's an open-door policy under that hat," Leon muttered. The RSH-12 spoke with a violence that redefined the room's atmosphere. The 12.7 by 55 millimeter slug struck the slanted face of the pyramid. The sound was not a bang. It was a metallic, clacker, thud that felt like a car crash in a closet. Sparks showered Leon's face, white-hot flakes of ancient iron and fresh lead. The pyramid didn't shatter, but the impact force snapped the executioner's head back with a sickening, wet crack of cervical vertebrae. The creature staggered. The great knife, still lodged in the wall, acted as a grim tether, preventing Pyramid Head from falling. A dark, viscous sludge began to seep from the fresh crater in the iron helmet, something that looked like motor oil mixed with bile. Leon didn't wait for a recovery. He fanned the hammer. Crack! The second round caught the entity in the shoulder joint, the massive projectile punching through the meat and exiting the back in a spray of dark, necrotic mist. The arm holding the knife went limp, the hand losing its grip. Crack! The third round struck the center of the chest, right where a human heart would be. The impact lifted the 7-foot monster off its feet, slamming it back against the hallway wall with enough force to collapse the plaster. Leon stepped forward, the smoke from the RSH-12's barrel drifting into his eyes. He didn't blink. He reached for the pyramid itself, his gloved hand gripping the jagged edge of the metal. "Room service," Leon growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. He jammed the muzzle of the revolver into the gap between the helmet and the shoulder. "This one's on the house." The hallway suddenly lurched. The walls didn't just peel, they dissolved. The gray wallpaper turned into sheets of rusted chainmail that fell away into an infinite burning void. The floorboards beneath Leon's boots transitioned into iron grates, glowing with a dull, subterranean heat. The other world wasn't just arriving, it was claiming the kill. Pyramid Head's hand, huge, gray, and trembling, suddenly clamped onto Leon's throat. The strength was impossible. A crushing hydraulic pressure that threatened to turn Leon's windpipe into a flattened straw. Leon's vision blurred. The RSH-12 felt like it weighed 100 pounds. "Stubborn bastard!" Leon wheezed, his finger tightening on the trigger for one final, point-blank, execution. The floor beneath them vanished. The sensation of falling in Silent Hill wasn't a clean acceleration toward the earth. It was a rhythmic, nauseating stutter through layers of reality. It felt like being dragged through a series of cold, wet veils. One moment, Leon was surrounded by the splintering wood of the Woodside Apartments. The next, he was plunging through a vertical shaft of rusted chain-link fences and spinning industrial fans. That groaned with the weight of centuries of neglect. The wind didn't whistle. It shrieked with the voices of 1,000 mechanical failures. Pyramid Head's hand remained a static, crushing vice around Leon's throat. The executioner's weight was pulling them both down faster than terminal velocity should allow. A dense, impossible mass of iron and necrotic muscle. Leon's lungs were burning, the oxygen in his bloodstream depleting as the monster's thumb pressed into his hyoid bone. The tactical reality of a mid-air grappling match favored the entity with the higher structural density. Leon Kennedy's brain, however, was operating on a level of cognitive efficiency that bypassed the panic reflex entirely. He analyzed the descent in frames. At the current rate of acceleration, they would impact a hard surface in approximately 6.4 seconds. If he continued to fire the RSH-12, the recoil in a zero-G environment would likely dislocate his own shoulder or send him into an uncontrollable tumble, ruining any chance of a survivable landing. Leon opted for a surgical precision. Leon's hand didn't move toward the RSH-12's trigger. Instead, he holstered the massive revolver with a fluid, blind motion, his fingers snapping the retention strap shut even as the world blurred into a streak of rust red and fire orange. "If you wanted an autograph," Leon wheezed, the words bubbling through a throat constricted by iron-hard fingers. "You should have just asked." With his right hand now free, Leon reached for the combat knife sheath at his chest. A custom-forged blade of high-carbon steel, serrated for the express purpose of rending through the toughened hides of BOWs. Leon didn't see a monster. He saw a series of mechanical linkages. The hand on his throat was a collection of tendons, phalanges, and carpal bones. If the tendons were severed, the grip would fail. It was a geometric certainty. He closed his eyes for a microsecond, tuning out the roar of the abyss to focus entirely on the tactile vibration of the monster's pulse, or the closest thing it had to one. Leon plunged the knife into the meat of Pyramid Head's wrist. The blade didn't slide in. It bit through the gray, leathery skin with a sickening, tactile crunch. The creature didn't scream, but the hand shivered. Leon twisted the blade, the serrated edge sawing through the ulnar nerve with a jagged, rhythmic motion. He felt the hot, oily spray of the monster's blood coat his forearm, a fluid that felt more like industrial lubricant than biological matter. With a guttural grunt of effort, Leon sliced upward, severing the extensor tendons. The executioner's fingers didn't just loosen, they snapped back like broken springs. The pressure on Leon's throat vanished. He didn't waste the momentum. He kicked off the creature's chest, the sole of his tactical boot connecting with the rusted metal of the pyramid helmet. The force of the kick sent Leon spinning away into a dark, horizontal opening in the shaft, a service vent that smelled of ozone and antiseptic. Pyramid Head continued to fall, its silent, iron-masked face staring up at Leon, as it vanished into the churning fire of the lower depths. Leon hit the metal floor of the vent with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the remaining air from his lungs. He slid 15 feet across the rusted grate, his jacket sparking against the metal until he came to a stop against a heavy, reinforced door. He lay there for a moment, the silence of the new environment rushing in to replace the scream of the fall. The air here was different. It was colder. It smelled of floor wax, old bandages, and the sharp chemical sting of formaldehyde. He reached up, his fingers gingerly touching the purple-black bruises forming on his neck. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a shredded whisper. "Next time, I'm taking the elevator." He looked up. Above the door, a flickering, dim sign hung by a single wire. Brookhaven Hospital, basement level. The light didn't just flicker, it pulsed in time with a low, wet, slapping sound, coming from the other side of the door. Leon stood up, his legs heavy, his vision swimming with the after effects of the strangulation. He reached for the ARSH-12, the weight of the gun feeling like an anchor in a world that was trying to drift away. He checked the cylinder. 3 rounds left. "Hospital, huh?" Leon muttered, the dry wit returning even as his body screamed in protest. "Good. I think I'm due for a checkup. He pushed the door open. The basement corridor of Brookhaven Hospital didn't just smell of decay, it smelled of effort. It was the scent of 1,000 failed surgeries, of industrial-grade bleach trying and failing to scrub the iron scent of arterial spray from the grout. The walls were weeping a thick, translucent ichor that pooled around the baseboards, vibrating in sympathy with the low-frequency hum of the flickering overhead flue or ascents. Leon stepped into the hall, his silhouette a jagged, tactical intrusion into the hospital's curated nightmare. The door behind him hissed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. "Great," Leon rasped, his hand instinctively going to his bruised throat. The skin was already a mottled tapestry of deep violet and broken capillaries. A hospital where the first thing you lose is your voice. I'd ask for a lozenge, but I'm guessing the nurses here only dispense lead-in trauma. He didn't raise the ARS-H-12. The 3 remaining 12.7 millimeter rounds were no longer ammunition. They were a retirement fund. He couldn't afford to spend them on the low-level staff. Instead, his hand dropped to the hilt of his combat knife, the grip tacky with the drying, synthetic blood of the executioner. From the shadows of the laundry room, they emerged, bubblehead nurses. Their movements were a horrific, synchronized twitch, a series of spastic, high-velocity tremors that made their heads appear as a blur of wet, translucent plastic. They wore uniforms that were several decades out of date, stained with the yellowed bile of long-dead patients. They didn't carry stethoscopes. They carried rusty iron pipes and serrated scalpels that had seen better centuries. The entity known as the bubblehead nurse is a fascinating evolutionary failure. It is a biological manifestation of the night complex, the inherent desire to protect and heal, twisted into a predatory reflex. They possess no eyes, yet they track movement via the micro-vibrations of the iron grates beneath Leon's boots. Leon Kennedy, however, is not a patient. He is an apex tactical variable. He didn't see a crowd of monsters. He saw a series of kinetic problems. He calculated the hallway's width, 84 inches, and identified the bottleneck. He didn't need to kill them all at once. He just needed to break their rhythm. Leon took a single, measured breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in his windpipe. "Bedside manners a bit lacking, girls," Leon muttered, the knife sliding from its sheath with a predatory wick. "How about we skip the physical and go straight to the autopsy?" The lead nurse lunged. It didn't run. It exploded forward in a series of disjointed, 4-foot leaps. Leon didn't retreat. He stepped into the nurse's reach, his left hand snapping up to catch the iron pipe mid-swing. The vibration of the impact traveled up his arm, but his grip remained a vice. With a sharp, sudden torque, he twisted the pipe, the nurse's wrist snapping with the dry, hollow sound of a dead branch. Before the entity could adjust, Leon drove the combat knife upward, under the jawline, and into the base of the bubble. The blade encountered a resistance like wet rubber, followed by a sudden release of pressurized, foul-smelling gas. He didn't pull the knife out. He used the embedded blade as a lever, spinning the nurse around and shoving her into the 2 sisters following behind. The pileup was a chaotic tangle of twitching limbs and clattering metal. Leon moved through the mess like a scalpel. He dropped to one knee, a horizontal sweep of his blade severing the Achilles tendon of a nurse trying to flank him. As she collapsed, he drove his elbow into the side of her head. The plastic-like skin didn't tear. It dented, the underlying skull fracturing with a muffled thud. He was a whirlwind of practiced, mechanical violence. A pipe swung at his head. He ducked, the metal whistling inches above his hair, and countered with a gut punch that felt like hitting a bag of wet gravel. He followed through with a knife thrust to the femoral artery, the nurse's leg giving way instantly, as dark, pressurized fluid sprayed across the floor. "You're out of network," Leon grunted, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He grabbed the last nurse by the back of her neck, his fingers digging into the cold, convulsing meat. He slammed her head first into a metal gurney, the impact sounding like a gong in the narrow hall. He didn't stop until the twitching ceased. He stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, the knife dripping a dark, iridescent sludge. The hallway was silent again, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of liquid falling from the overhead pipes. He wiped the blade on his trousers, his eyes scanning the gloom. At the end of the hall, a heavy iron door marked solitary confinement began to rattle, not from a lunge, but from something heavy leaning against it. A woman's voice drifted through the small, barred window of the door. It was soft, melodic, and entirely too sane for this level of the abyss. "Leon, is that you? I thought I heard a gentleman down here." Leon froze, and the voice was a perfect, crystalline mimicry of Ida Wong. But there was an underlying tremor of vulnerability that the spy never allowed. "I'm not a gentleman," Leon whispered, his hand going back to the ARSH-12. "I'm just the guy who didn't get the memo about the visiting hours." He approached the door, the 12.7 millimeter barrel leading the way. Leon didn't reach for the latch. He didn't even shift his weight toward the door. Instead, he planted his boots, the RSH-12 remaining dead level with the narrow, barred slit at eye height. The weapon didn't tremble. In the flickering, jaundiced light of the basement, the revolver looked less like a firearm and more like a permanent extension of his skeletal structure. "Nice try," Leon said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that seemed to grate against the silence. "But the last woman who called me a gentleman tried to drop a skyscraper on my head. You're going to have to do better than a vocal impression." There was a pause, and the air in the hallway seemed to thicken, turning from a gas into a heavy, semi-liquid pressure. From inside the cell, the sound of a soft, rhythmic pacing began, the sound of silk sliding against skin, followed by the faint, impossible scent of expensive perfume and gunpowder. "You're so cold, Leon," the voice replied. It was smoother now, shedding the vulnerability for a playful, razor-sharp edge. "Is that what they taught you in the Secret Service? How to ignore a lady in the dark? Or is it just that you're afraid of what you'll see if you turn the light on?" The narrative architecture of the town was attempting a Turing test of trauma. It was no longer generating physical threats because it had identified that the subject possessed a hard-coded combat loop, a psychological defense mechanism where external violence actually increases cognitive clarity. To break Leon Kennedy, the environment had to shift from the survival horror genre to psychological thriller. It was attempting to utilize the Lady in Red archetype, a composite entity constructed from Leon's memories of Ida Wong. However, the town's intelligence was failing to account for one critical variable. Leon's cynicism was not a mask. It was a reinforced bunker. He wasn't participating in a ghost story. He was conducting a tactical interrogation. Leon's eyes narrowed, scanning the doorframe, not for a keyhole, but for the seams in reality. "Interrogation. 1-0-1, Leon muttered, his thumb resting on the hammer of the RSH-12. If the witness knows too much, they're either a plant or the perp. Tell me something only a ghost would know. Tell me the color of the ribbon in Raccoon City. The rattling of the door stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to suck the heat out of the room. The ribbon was white. Leon, the voice whispered, now directly against the bars. Before it turned red, just like everything else you touch. Leon felt a cold spike of adrenaline, not the combat-ready surge, but the hollow, sickening drop of a memory being weaponized. He saw the fire. He felt the heat of the Raccoon City explosion on his back. He felt the weight of the girl, Sherry, in his arms. The town was digging, its metaphorical claws scraping against the scar tissue of 1998. It was looking for the guilt key that would allow it to bypass his ballistic defenses. Wrong, Leon said, his finger tightening on the trigger. It was blue. You're a bad hallucination, with a worse script. He didn't fire. He used the butt of the RSH-12 to strike the iron bars. The metallic clang, echoing down the hallway like a thunderclap. If you want me to open this door, give me the proof of life, Leon demanded. Solve the riddle of the room. Why is the clock in the lobby stuck at midnight? The walls of the hallway began to warp. The iron door didn't open, but the metal began to bleed a dark, viscous ink that formed symbols on the floor. A series of 3 circular indentations surrounded by Latin script. 3 lives given to the silent deep. 1 for the father who could not weep. 1 for the mother who could not stay. 1 for the child who was led astray. A small, rusted box materialized in the center of the symbols. It required 3 coins. Tokens of a life lived in the shadow of the town. A scavenger hunt in a slaughterhouse, Leon remarked, his gaze shifting from the door to the dark corridor behind him. Brell, would have just used a key card. You guys really like to make people work for their trauma. He didn't look back at the cell. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't see a woman. He'd see a mirror. Stay put. Ida, Leon said, his boots clicking as he turned away. I'll go get your change. But if I come back and you've changed your hair, the deal's off. The hospital chapel was a masterclass in theological gore. The pews weren't made of oak. They were constructed from layers of petrified, gray muscle, polished to a high sheen by the friction of 1,000 phantom worshippers. Above the altar, a crucifix hung suspended by rusted meat hooks, but the figure upon it was unrecognizable, a geometric nightmare of interlocking cages and weeping sores. The air didn't just carry the scent of incense, it carried the heavy, suffocating heat of a blast furnace. Leon stepped onto the narrow balcony overlooking the nave. Below him, the floor had opened into a jagged caldera of molten iron and screaming embers. A localized hell that pulsed in time with the town's unseen heart. The first coin sat upon a pedestal of fused vertebrae at the very edge of the balcony's precipice. It was the coin of the burning father, its surface etched with the image of a man whose head was a blooming crown of thorns. Found the tip, Leon rasped, his voice barely a ghost of itself. Now I just need to get out of the restaurant before the bill arrives. He didn't walk toward the coin. He cleared the rafters first, his eyes scanning the vaulted ceiling where the shadows seemed to have a predatory weight. The entity known as the Missionaire E did not descend. It collapsed into the physical plane, an 80-pound mass of serrated steel blades and fanatical zealotry. It utilized the gravitational acceleration of a 30-foot drop to maximize the kinetic impact of its initial strike. Its blades, twin scythes grafted directly into the radius and ulna, were vibrating at a frequency designed to bypass standard Kevlar weave. Leon's ocular nerves registered the blur in 0.08 seconds. To the Missionaire E, Leon was a static target. To Leon, the Missionaire E was a ballistic trajectory that required a zero-sum correction. Leon didn't dive. He dropped into a crouch, the ASH-12 coming up in a two-handed grip. The Missionary struck the stone balcony with a sound like a meat cleaver hitting a marble slab. The stone fractured, spiderwebbing beneath the creature's weight. Before it could pivot, Leon fired. Crack. The 12.7-millimeter round caught the Missionaire E in its armored hood. The projectile, designed to stop engine blocks, didn't just penetrate. It delivered a hydrostatic shock wave that liquefied the creature's vestibular system. The Missionaire E's head snapped back, its body performing a grotesque, involuntary backflip from the sheer momentum of the lead. But it didn't die. The creature's blades sparked against the iron railing as it corrected its fall with supernatural agility. It lunged again, its movements a chaotic, insectoid scuttle that defied the narrow constraints of the balcony. Leon's finger hovered over the trigger for his penultimate round. One for the collection, Leon muttered. He waited until the blades were inches from his throat, the heat from the pit below singeing the hair on the back of his neck. He stepped back, his heel hanging over the abyss, and used the weight of the RSH-12 as a bludgeon. He smashed the heavy steel barrel into the missionary's face, the impact echoing through the chapel. As the creature stumbled, Leon reached out and snatched the coin from the pedestal with a brutal, focused kick to the Missionaire's chest. Leon sent the zealot over the railing. The creature didn't scream as it fell into the molten caldera. It merely hissed, a sound of steam hitting a hot radiator, before it was incinerated in a plume of ultraviolet fire. Leon stood on the crumbling edge, the coin of the burning father hot in his gloved palm. He looked down at the ARSH-12. 2 rounds left. The chapel began to tilt. The walls were melting, the petrified pews turning back into raw, screaming meat. The door he had entered through was now 30 feet above him, the balcony transforming into a spiraling, unstable staircase of bone. Always with the stairs, Leon sighed. The heat of the chapel didn't dissipate. It was severed. Leon stepped through the heavy iron door of the 3rd floor, solarium, and the atmosphere shifted from a blast furnace to a meat locker in the span of a single heartbeat. The transition was so abrupt it caused the moisture on his tactical jacket to flash freeze, the fabric stiffening with a crystalline crackle. The room was a geometric void of peeling white paint and rusted ivy stands. In the center of the far wall, a single CRT television sat atop a rolling metal cart. It wasn't plugged into anything, yet the screen hummed with a violent, crimson luminescence. A perfect, glowing red square occupied the center of the glass, the town's mocking interpretation of a sanctuary. Leon approached it, the RSH-12's barrel casting a long, distorted shadow against the flickering red glow. "A save point," Leon rasped, the words catching in his bruised throat. "What's the matter? Afraid I'm going to rage quit before the final act?" Leon didn't touch the screen. He didn't have to. As he stood within 3 feet of the cart, the red square dissolved into a blizzard of gray and black static. The audio was a cacophony of wet, tearing sounds, and the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heart monitor flatlining. Then the image stabilized. The footage was grainy, overexposed, and filtered through a sickening sepia tint. It showed a basement cell, the exact cell Leon had just left Maria in. But the woman sitting on the cot wasn't a blonde mirage in a red skirt. It was Claire Redfield. She was wearing her TerraSave uniform, her hair matted with dried blood, her hands zip-tied behind a rusted pipe. She wasn't screaming. She was staring directly into the camera lens with an expression of cold, hollowed-out exhaustion that Leon recognized from the mirrors of a dozen safe houses. "Leon!" Her voice came through the TV's mono speaker, distorted by a digital lag. "Don't come down here. It's not, it's not her. It's the virus. They're using the town to incubate the video cut to a shot of a massive, shadowed figure standing in the doorway of her cell. A familiar silhouette, a trench coat, a gray, stony face. Mr. X. "Claire," Leon whispered, his grip tightening on the RSH-12 until the metal groaned. He knew it was a trap. He knew the town was cannibalizing his memories of the Raccoon City incident and the subsequent bioterror outbreaks to build a custom-made hell. But the physics of the footage were wrong. It was too detailed for a hallucination. It was a multiversal leak, a fragment of a reality where Claire had been the one to follow the lead to Silent Hill. Leon smashed his gloved fist into the top of the CRT monitor. The glass didn't shatter. It rippled like water, the red glow bleeding out and staining his knuckles. The sound of Claire's voice was replaced by a high-pitched, electronic shriek. That felt like a needle being driven into his ear canal. "Nice try, you son of a bitch," Leon growled, his voice a jagged edge of pure defiance. "But Claire doesn't ask for help. She gives it. You want to play Biohazard? Fine. Let's see how your god handles a 12.7 millimeter vaccine." He turned away from the screen, his eyes burning with a cold, focused rage that the town's psychological filters couldn't suppress. He didn't need the third coin. He didn't need the puzzle. He was going back to the basement, and he was going to burn it all down. The elevator doors weren't just stuck. They had been surgically fused by a growth of jagged, oxidized copper that pulsed with a dull, rhythmic heat. Leon didn't even bother pressing the call button. He turned his back on the lobby's flickering save point and headed for the emergency stairwell, only to find the door transformed into a solid slab of petrified bone. "Lockdown," Leon rasped, his voice a dry friction of sound. "Fine. If you won't let me use the stairs, I'll find a more direct route. Your fire escape is overdue for an inspection anyway." He pivoted, his boots crunching through a layer of frost that had begun to coat the floor, and sprinted toward the roof access ladder. He climbed with a mechanical, predatory urgency, his muscles screaming against the sudden exertion. The roof of Brookhaven Hospital was a jagged island of tar and gravel, floating in a sea of absolute, roiling blackness. The fog was gone, replaced by a vertical abyss that seemed to swallow the light from his tactical shoulder lamp. In the distance, the town's sirens began to wail, not the air raid sirens of the fog world, but a distorted, multitonal shriek that sounded like a choir of dying machines. Leon reached the heavy steel door of the roof's mechanical penthouse. The hinges were caked in a century's worth of rust, and a thick, black sludge that smelled of old oil and burnt hair. The structural integrity of the penthouse door was rated for 120-mile-per-hour winds. It was not, however, engineered to withstand the concentrated kinetic delivery of a 12.7 by 55 millimeter armor-piercing round at point-blank range. Leon's decision was not an act of desperation. It was a cold-blooded calculation of time versus attrition. Every second spent searching for a key was a second the Tyrant executioner in the basement spent perfecting its genetic architecture. To Leon, a bullet was simply a very loud, very fast key. Leon braced the RSH-12 against his hip, his feet digging into the gravel. "Excuse me," Leon muttered, "just passing through." The RSH-12 discharged with a roar that felt like it cracked the sky. The 12.7 millimeter slug struck the upper hinge assembly, the kinetic energy instantly vaporizing the rusted iron and turning the surrounding concrete into a cloud of jagged shrapnel. The recoil sent a shock wave through Leon's arm. That would have shattered a lesser man's radius, but he absorbed the force through a practiced bend of the elbow. The door didn't just open, it was sheared off its mountings, hurtling into the darkness of the stairwell, with a metallic clang that echoed all the way to the foundation. One round left. Leon didn't pause to admire the wreckage. He grabbed a coil of heavy-gauge, rusted surgical wire from a nearby maintenance rack. Wire designed for bone setting, now repurposed for a terminal descent. He looped it around a reinforced vent pipe, testing the anchor with a brutal, one-handed tug. "No harness, no backup," Leon whispered, his eyes fixed on the black void below. "Just like Raccoon City, only the scenery's worse." He stepped off the ledge. The descent was a chaotic blur of shadow and steel. Leon rappelled down the exterior of Brookhaven, his boots kicking off the rusted window frames as he dropped 10 feet at a time. Above him, the sky began to bleed, a deep, bruised purple that cast long, flickering shadows across the hospital's facade. Halfway down the 4th floor, he saw it. Through the shattered glass of the maternity ward, a massive, pale shape was pacing. It stood 8 feet tall, draped in a tattered, blackened trench coat that seemed to be stitched directly into its gray, cadaverous skin. It didn't have a face, only a smooth, stony slab of flesh. But on its head, it wore a crown of rusted, triangular iron, the Tyrant executioner. The creature stopped. It turned its head toward the window, sensing the vibration of the wire. Leon didn't stop. He pushed off the wall with a violent kick, swinging himself through a wide arc as he bypassed the monster's floor. "I'll be with you in a minute," Leon growled, as he plummeted toward the basement level. "Don't go anywhere." He reached the ground floor just as the surgical wire snapped, the rusted metal finally surrendering to the tension. He hit the wet asphalt of the delivery bay in a controlled roll, coming up with his knife in his left hand and his final 12.7 millimeter round in the chamber of the RSH-12. He stood in front of the basement's service entrance. The door was marked with a familiar symbol, a red and white umbrella, but the colors were inverted, black and rust. Leon took a breath, the scent of copper and formaldehyde filling his lungs. "Okay, Brell, let's see what you've been cooking in this kitchen." Leon didn't push the door open. The door surrendered. As the rusted hinges groaned, the sterile chemical stench of Brookhaven Hospital was violently replaced. The heavy, suffocating scent of gun oil, ozone, and old coffee. The transition wasn't a visual fade. It was a sensory hijacking. The cold, wet asphalt of the delivery bay beneath his boots became polished, checkered marble, a lobby he had seen in 1,000 nightmares. Leon stepped forward, his final 12.7 millimeter round chambered, his pulse a steady rhythmic thrum against his bruised windpipe. "Home sweet home," Leon whispered, his voice a jagged rasp. "I should have known. All roads lead back to the first day on the job." He was standing in the main hall of the Raccoon City Police Station, but the goddess statue in the center didn't hold a jug of water. She held a rusted, jagged, great knife. Her face had been smoothed over into a featureless slab of stone. The emergency shutters were down, but they weren't made of steel. They were constructed from the same petrified, weeping meat as the hospital pews. The spatial anomaly Leon has just entered is the 0 point of trauma. In the architectural lexicon of the abyss, this is not a geographical location. It is a mnemonic containment unit. The town has ceased attempting to scare Leon Kennedy with generic nurses and mannequins. It has realized that Leon's psychological armor is forged from the literal collapse of a civilization. To break the man, it must recreate the site of the failure. The RPD is the crucible where Leon's identity was born and where his innocence was incinerated. By projecting this specific geography, the town is attempting to induce navigational vertigo. The feeling of being trapped in a loop where every door leads to a different regret. Leon walked toward the reception desk. Sitting in the chair was a figure in an RPD uniform. Its skin was the color of a bruised plum, its limbs twitching with the rhythmic, staccato spasms of the T-virus infected. But where its head should have been, a small, rusted, iron pyramid had been grafted onto the neck, the metal weeping a dark, iridescent fluid. "Marvin?" Leon asked, his hand tightening on the ARSH-12. The entity didn't moan. It stood up, its movements a horrific fusion of zombie lethality and executioner weight. It reached into a locker behind the desk and pulled out a bundle of blood-stained blue fabric, Leon's original RPD uniform. "Keep it," Leon said, his eyes turning into chips of blue ice. "I'm not looking for a promotion. I'm looking for the exit." To understand the psychological mirror, one must discard the notion of Silent Hill as a haunted town. It is in reality a psionic amplifier, a localized distortion in reality that operates as a biological mirror. It does not possess a will of its own. It possesses a refractive intelligence. The town functions on a frequency that interacts directly with the human unconscious. When a subject enters the fog, the town's source scans the psyche for emotional debt, guilt, repression, and grief. The mirror doesn't just show the subject what they fear, it shows them what they believe they deserve. For Leon Kennedy, the mirror is struggling. Leon does not feel personal guilt in the traditional sense. He feels tactical failure. He doesn't regret killing. He regrets being unable to save. Therefore, the town is mirroring his history with Umbrella. The zombies are being upgraded with executioner motifs because the town is trying to convince Leon that he is the one who needs to be judged for the Raccoon City fallout. The other world is the mirror's total reflection mode. It occurs when the subject's internal turmoil reaches a boiling point. The environment physically breaks down because the subject's mental state can no longer support the illusion of a normal world. The transition from Brookhaven to the RPD is a sign. Leon's presence is so potent, it is overriding the town's default settings. He isn't being trapped by the town. He is accidentally terraforming it into a biohazard zone. The pyrozombie lunged. It didn't shuffle. It moved with the explosive, bone-breaking momentum of a crimson head. Leon didn't fire. He stepped inside the guard, the ASH-12 acting as a steel weight. He drove the butt of the revolver into the side of the iron pyramid, the sound a resonant, hollow gong. That sent a spray of black fluid across the marble floor. He followed with a low sweep, his boot snapping the entity's fibula. As the creature hit the ground, Leon placed his boot on the rusted metal head. pinning it. Tell the manager, Leon rasped, leaning down. The nostalgia trip didn't work. I've already buried the city once. I have no problem doing it again. He looked toward the West Wing. The lockers there were rattling. Each one contained a fragment of his past. His first gun, the radio he used to talk to Ida, the blood-stained bandage from his shoulder. But at the end of the hall, a familiar shadow grew. A heavy, rhythmic footfall echoed through the precinct. Thump, thump, thump. The trench coat, the gray skin, the pyramid head. Double or nothing, Leon muttered, raising his final bullet. The hallway outside the West office didn't just smell like the RPD, it smelled like fear. That specific, cold sweat and recycled air stench of a man realizing he's out of his depth. Leon's boots remained heavy, deliberate, and silent on the marble. His gloved thumb rested on the hammer of the RSH-12. One round, one solution. From around the corner of the darkened corridor, a shadow sprinted. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thud of a tyrant or the metallic scrape of a great knife. These were sloppy, frantic footfalls, the sound of someone running for their life without a tactical plan. The figure collided with a pile of overturned desks, a standard issue VP-70, 9mm, clattering across the floor. Don't stay back. The voice was a gut punch. It was higher, lighter, and lacked the gravel of 2 decades of global bioterror. Leon stepped into the flickering light of a hanging fluorescent fixture. Across the hall, scrambled on his knees, was a younger man. He wore the high-collared, pristine blue tactical vest of a rookie officer on his first day. His blonde hair was damp with sweat, and his eyes, the same blue as Leon's, were wide, dilated with a terror that hadn't yet been hardened into cynicism. The rookie scrambled for his 9mm, his hands shaking so violently the metal rattled against the floorboards. I said, stay back! I'll shoot! The town's psychological architecture has finally achieved its masterpiece, the paradoxical mirror. It is not presenting a monster to be slain, but a temporal asset to be protected. By manifesting the 1998 iteration of Leon S. Kennedy, the environment has forced the subject into a recursive loop of self-preservation. If Leon treats the rookie as a hallucination and executes him, he risks a symbolic suicide that would shatter his remaining psychological cohesion. If he protects him, he is anchored by a vulnerable, unskilled liability in a high-threat zone. The town is no longer trying to kill Leon. It is trying to make him responsible for his own past. It is the ultimate trolley problem of the soul. Save the man you were, or become the monster you fear. Leon didn't lower the RSH-12. He didn't even soften his expression. He looked at the rookie the way a mechanic looks at a stripped bolt. Ease up, kid, Leon rasped, the sound like a serrated blade on stone. You're going to blow a hole in the ceiling, and we only have one set of ears left. The rookie froze. He looked at the older Leon, the scarred face, the bruised throat, the massive, impossible Russian revolver, and the cold, dead-eyed stare of a man who had seen the world end 3 times over. Who are you? The rookie stammered. Are you with the RPD? Did the chief send you? The chief is a taxidermist who likes to play with dolls, Leon replied, his voice devoid of empathy. And the RPD is currently a memory being eaten by a nightmare. You're in the wrong zip code. Rookie. Suddenly, and the walls of the hallway began to breathe. The gray plaster bubbled and tore, revealing layers of pulsating, red muscle beneath. The looming red, the tyrant, executioner, rounded the corner at the end of the hall. It stood 9 feet tall now, its gray skin stretched tight over a massive, biologically enhanced frame. One arm ended in a five-fingered claw, the other gripped a great knife that had fused with a rusted hospital divider. It didn't roar. It simply stepped forward, the floorboards snapping under its multi-ton weight. The rookie scrambled backward, his 9mm barking 3 times. Population, population, population. The bullet struck the tyrant's chest, sparking harmlessly against the stony hide. It's not stopping, the rookie screamed. Leon stepped in front of the younger man, his silhouette blocking the rookie's view of the monster. He felt the heat of the tyrant's presence, the smell of ozone and necrotic rot. He looked at the ARSH-12, 1 round. Of course it's not, Leon muttered. You're bringing a pea shooter to a god-killing. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, a sympathetic phantom wound where the rookie had once been stabbed. The town was tightening the knot. Get behind me, Leon commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. And for God's sake, stop screaming. You're giving me a headache. Leon raised the ARSH-12, the 12.7mm barrel steady as a mountain, aiming directly for the center of the tyrant's iron-crowned head. The tyrant executioner was no longer walking. It was reclaiming the space. Every footfall of its leaden, gray boots didn't just vibrate the floorboards. It caused the checkered marble of the RPD lobby to liquefy into a dark, tectonic slurry of oil and bone. The monster's dual nature, the clinical, relentless pursuit of the T-003, and the ritualistic, agonizing judgment of Pyramid Head had reached a state of perfect, biological equilibrium. Leon felt the air in his lungs turn to glass. The sympathetic pain in his chest, mirrored from the rookie's future past trauma, was becoming a physical anchor. Leon, what do we do? The rookie gasped, his VP-70 clicking rhythmically as he pulled the trigger on an empty chamber. He had burned his last 9mm magazine into a wall of manifested indifference. It's not dying, it's not even slowing down. Older Leon looked down at the RSH-12 in his hand. The 12.7 by 55mm revolver felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was the physical accumulation of every bullet he had fired since 1998. Every monster he had buried, and every person he had failed to bring back. The tactical impasse had reached its logical conclusion. The tyrant executioner was a manifestation of Leon Kennedy's cumulative trauma. To the older Leon, the monster was an immortal constant, a beast he had fought 1,000 times across 100 different biomes. In his mind, the nightmare never truly ended. However, the 1998 rookie possessed a variable the relic had long since lost: actual hope. In the rookie's timeline, the nightmare was still a tragedy that could be averted. By handing the weapon to the rookie, Leon was not just transferring a firearm, he was performing a psychological offloading. He was placing the power of the end state into the hands of the beginning state. Leon didn't look at the monster. He looked at the kid. Kid, Leon rasped, the sound like gravel in a blender. Take it. He didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed the rookie's shaking hand and slammed the grip of the RSH-12 into his palm. The rookie nearly buckled under the weight of the massive Russian steel. This isn't a 9mm, Leon warned, his voice a lethal whisper. The recoil will try to take your shoulder off. The weight will try to break your wrist. But that thing in front of us, it isn't real. It's just a debt. And you're the only one here whose credit is still good. The synthesis was instantaneous. As the rookie's fingers closed around the cold, textured grip, the coin of the burning father in Leon's pocket flared with a blinding, ultraviolet intensity. The two Leons weren't just standing next to each other, their biosignatures were overlapping. The rookie's wide-eyed terror began to draw from the older Leon's tactical coldness. The older Leon's cynical exhaustion began to draw from the rookie's raw, uncorrupted will to survive. "Aim for the center of the iron," Leon commanded, stepping behind the rookie and bracing the kid's shoulder with his own scarred hand. "Don't think about the city. Don't think about the girl. Just think about the next step." The tyrant executioner lunged. It didn't swing the great knife. It thrust the blade forward like a spear, the rusted metal shrieking as it tore through the air. The rookie pulled the trigger. The RSH-12 didn't fire, so much as it detonated. The muzzle flash was a 3-foot cone of white-hot plasma. That illuminated every corner of the RPD lobby, casting two long, fused shadows against the back wall. The 12.7 millimeter armor-piercing round, now infused with the necrotic heat of the coin, struck the tyrant executioner directly in the center of its stony chest. The physics of the impact were absolute. The projectile didn't just penetrate, it created a localized vacuum that sucked the monster's internal structure into the exit wound. The tyrant's trench coat disintegrated into blackened confetti, its gray skin fractured like cheap porcelain. Because the shot was fired by the innocent hand of the rookie, the manifestation lost its anchor to the older Leon's guilt. The tyrant executioner didn't fall. It dissolved. It turned into a swarm of black butterflies that vanished into the high, vaulted ceiling of the precinct, leaving nothing behind but a lingering scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic clack of the spent 12.7 millimeter casing hitting the marble. The rookie collapsed to his knees, his arm numb, the ASH-12 smoking in his hand. He looked up at the older Leon, his face pale. Did we win?" Older Leon took the gun back, the barrel still radiating a supernatural heat. He looked toward the exit doors. The RPD was fading. The checkers were turning back into hospital tiles. The goddess statue was becoming a gurney. "No, kid," Leon said, his voice softer now. "We just survived. And in this town, that's as close to a win as you're ever going to get." The RPD lobby didn't simply vanish. It eroded. The checkered marble floor began to flake away like dry skin, revealing the rusted, vibrating iron grates of the Brookhaven basement beneath. The goddess statue's stone flesh curdled, melting into a heap of discarded surgical scrubs and oxidized bone. Leon stood in the center of the collapsing memory, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. A shadow that didn't belong to a single man, but to a composite entity of two distinct eras. The rookie remained on his knees for a heartbeat longer, the empty RSH-12 gripped in his white-knuckled hand. He looked up at his older self, the terror in his eyes replaced by a dawning, horrific comprehension. He wasn't looking at a stranger anymore. He was looking at his own inevitable conclusion. Older Leon reached down, his scarred, gloved hand closing over the rookie's. He didn't pull the younger man up. He simply leaned in, his face inches from the version of himself that still believed in serving and protecting. "Keep the wait," Leon whispered, his voice a scorched rasp that barely carried over the sound of the world tearing apart. "The gun is empty, but the weight, that's yours to carry. Don't let it go." The rookie nodded, a slow, solemn movement. He stood up, his movements mirroring the older Leon's tactical posture. For a brief, impossible stretch of time, they walked together through the in-between, a hallway where one side was the wood-paneled corridors of the precinct, and the other was the slime-coated walls of the hospital's deepest sublevel. "There's a girl down there," the rookie said, his voice regaining a fraction of its youthful clarity. "Claire, we have to—" "I know," older Leon interrupted, his eyes fixed on the red-lit door at the end of the hall. "But this isn't the Claire you know. This is the town's version of a bioorganic CPU. She's the heart of the machine. To save her, we have to break the machine. Do you understand?" The rookie looked at the ARSH-12. He looked at the older man's empty holster. "I don't have any bullets," the rookie whispered. "Neither do I," older Leon replied, a grim, humorless smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's why we're going to use the architecture. I saw them through the ventilation shaft, two of them. One looked like he'd been through a war that hadn't happened yet, and the other looked like he'd just stepped out of a recruitment poster. They were moving in sync, a double helix of blue and gray. The air around them was screaming, literally screaming, as the two realities ground against each other like tectonic plates. The older one, the one with the bruised neck, he didn't even look scared. He looked like he was taking a walk through a park. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin that was glowing so bright it hurt to look at. He didn't throw it. He just held it. And as they reached the final door, the older one looked back at the younger one and did something I'll never forget. He saluted. The transition was final. The RPD hallway snapped out of existence like a blown fuse. Leon stood alone in front of the source, a massive circular chamber at the very bottom of Brookhaven. In the center, suspended by a web of translucent, pulsing umbilical cords, was Claire Redfield. She was encased in a crystalline shell of T-virus and otherworld ash. Behind her, the god of Silent Hill, a towering, multi-limbed monstrosity of fused flesh and rusted machinery, was beginning to detach itself from the ceiling. It didn't have a face. It had the umbrella logo etched into a slab of gray muscle where a face should be. Older Leon didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the coin of the burning father. "Last chance for a refund," Leon rasped, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He didn't fire a bullet. He didn't swing a knife. He slammed the glowing coin into the ground-level iron grate. The reaction was tectonic. The coin, acting as a spiritual conductor for Leon's condensed synthesis energy, ignited the necrotic gas filling the chamber. The floor didn't just explode. It became a geyser of white-hot, cleansing fire. The flame traveled up the umbilical cords, turning the god's own biological network into a fuse. The monster let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was the sound of 1,000 hard drives being erased simultaneously. Leon stood in the center of the fire, his jacket melting, his skin blistering, his eyes never leaving the crystalline shell where Claire was held. He watched as the rookie's shadow, the one he had left behind in the mirror, leaped from the flames, a phantom of 1998 courage that shattered the crystal with a ghostly 9mm shaped strike. The world shattered. The basement didn't just collapse, it surrendered to gravity's final, impatient demand. The heat from the ultraviolet fire had turned the structural steel into glowing ribbons of orange wax. Leon's left arm, hooked under Claire Redfield's knees, his right arm braced her against his chest. She was a dead weight, a silent, breathing cargo of multiversal trauma. Her pulse a steady, defiant, 60 beats per minute against his collarbone. He didn't have a voice to shout for an exit. He didn't have a bullet to clear the way. He only had the momentum of a man who refused to be the last one standing in a dying world. The biological mechanics of the human frame are designed to fail at a certain threshold of oxygen debt and cellular fatigue. Leon S. Kennedy had passed that threshold 3 floors ago. His current locomotion was a product of absolute assertion, a cognitive override where the central nervous system ignores the frantic stop signals from the musculature. The building was descending at a rate of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared into the caldera. The path to the surface was a vertical impossibility. Therefore, the only viable vector was lateral. The flooded subtunnels that connected the hospital's morgue to the Toluca Lake drainage system. The wall separating the basement from the tunnels was reinforced concrete, 3 feet thick. To a normal man, it was a tomb. To the man who had just used his own past as a kinetic weapon, it was merely a suggestion. Leon didn't look for a door. He looked for the fracture line where the heat had turned the concrete brittle. He didn't punch the wall. He drove his entire body mass and Claire's into the stress point, using a discarded, heavy-duty oxygen tank as a pneumatic ram. The impact wasn't a sound. It was a concussion that vibrated through Leon's teeth. The concrete didn't crack. It shattered into 1,000 gray, jagged teeth. The sudden vacuum of the subtunnel sucked the smoke and heat forward. Then came the water. It was black, freezing, and tasted of ancient silt and industrial runoff. It hit Leon with the force of a freight train, knocking the final remnants of air from his lungs. He held her. He didn't let go even as the ceiling of Brookhaven Hospital finally groaned its last. It pancaked into the fire behind them. He kicked. The weight of his tactical boots, once an asset, was now a leaden liability. He fought the current of the drainage pipe, his vision tunneling into a single, pinprick white light, miles ahead. The camera pulls back, rising above the jagged, smoking ruins of the hospital. The ultraviolet fire is fading, replaced by the cold, indifferent gray of a silent hill morning. For the first time in recorded history, the fog is not rolling in. It is receding. The mist thins over Toluca Lake, revealing the surface as a sheet of dark glass. A mile from the shoreline, a rusted drainage grate bursts outward. 2 figures spill into the shallows. A man in a shredded leather jacket and a woman in a faded red vest. Leon drags Claire onto the gray sand. He collapses beside her, his chest heaving in rhythmic, agonizing hitches. He looks up at the sky. The clouds are breaking. A single, weak ray of sunlight hits the water. In the distance, the sound of a high-performance engine breaks the silence. The Porsche Cayenne, no longer rusted, no longer a ghost, idles at the edge of the access road. The doors open. Leon looks at Claire. She stirs, her eyes flickering open. She sees the sun. She sees the man who hasn't changed, even if the world has. Leon Kennedy can't speak. He doesn't need to. He simply offers a gloved hand, his fingers steady, his gaze fixed on the road out of town. The transmission holds. Your unwavering focus, your absolute gaze, serves as the singular anchor point for these colliding realities. You didn't just watch, you stabilized the breach. Portal Comic X remains tethered to this plane only because you chose to endure the friction of the void until the very end. You are the battery. You are the witness. This channel is the only lens capable of capturing the collapse, and you are its pulse. Subscribe to the frequency now and step directly into the next anomaly. The portal is wide, and it is waiting.